Hey there. Tonight we're going somewhere quieter than usual. No screaming kings, no riots, no executions. Just a long stone hallway, a smell of beeswax, and a faint whisper of Gregorian chant echoing under vaulted ceilings. It's the kind of place where you could almost hear the centuries breathing. Welcome to the monastery, a world where time didn't tick, it burned. Before clocks, before gears, before the nervous pulse of modern seconds, people didn't measure time. They lived inside it. The medieval monk's life was one long conversation with eternity. Every hour, every prayer, every flicker of light meant something. And the thing that told them when to kneel, when to eat, and when to sleep wasn't a machine, it was a candle. That might sound simple, even poetic, but for the monks it was deadly serious. Their entire existence revolved around what they called the divine office. 8 periods of prayer spaced throughout the day and night. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour belonged to God. The problem was, the sun doesn't always cooperate. Summer days stretch. Winter ones collapse. Clouds lie. So the monks built their own light, their own miniature suns out of wax and flame. If you'd wandered into a Benedictine abbey around the 13th century, you'd find no ticking clocks. Instead, you'd see candles marked with small lines, grooves, or even tiny iron pins inserted at measured intervals. Each mark represented a slice of time, a slow, golden countdown. A monk would light the candle at a prescribed hour, and as it burned, he'd watch it descend toward each marker. When the wax melted past a line, he'd ring the bell, calling the brothers to prayer. Sometimes, the candle was fitted with nails that fell with a soft clink into a metal tray when they dropped, an audible signal in the darkness. A delicate, holy alarm clock. It's beautiful when you think about it. How these men, isolated from the world, tried to tame the infinite using something as fragile as fire. But it wasn't just practicality. The symbolism ran deep. To the medieval mind, light was divine order made visible. God was light, time was his rhythm, and the candle was a living sermon. Every inch of melting wax was a lesson. Time consumes, but it also reveals. In some monasteries, candles weren't measured by hours but by prayers. The monks would recite psalms as the candle burned, and when it reached a certain point, they knew to stop. In this way, time was literally made of devotion. Imagine your minutes measured not by numbers, but by prayers whispered into smoke. The candle's steady decline was also a reminder of mortality, that every life, no matter how bright, burned down to the same pool of wax. The monks didn't just see that as poetic. They saw it as moral. To waste time was to waste life. To watch the candle too closely, vanity. To let it burn unattended, neglect. To blow it out early, a sin. Of course, not all monasteries agreed on how to keep time. Some relied on hourglasses, some on water clocks, others on sundials when weather allowed. But the candle had a special intimacy. It worked in the dark, could be carried, spoke softly, and for centuries, that soft voice of wax and flame dictated the rhythm of the medieval world. If you stood in the cloister after midnight, when the world outside slept and the only sound was wind and breath, you'd see the candles lined up like sentinels, their flames trembling against the stone. Every few minutes, one would gutter, another would be lit. Time didn't move forward. It simply passed from one wick to the next. For the monks, that repetition wasn't monotonous, it was sacred. The burning candle represented obedience to rhythm, a kind of cosmic heartbeat. They didn't see it as time passing, but as time being offered back to God. It's a strange thing to imagine now, that somewhere between the ringing of bells and the whisper of psalms, people once watched time die and called it holy. But life in a monastery was built on that paradox. To withdraw from the world was to live closer to its essence. To spend your days in silence was to hear creation's pulse more clearly. And to measure your hours with melting wax was to understand, more than most of us ever will, that time is both precious and perishable. There was a hierarchy to it all, too. Not everyone in the monastery was allowed to tend the candles. The task fell to a specific brother, sometimes called the celerarius or the sacristan, whose duty was to maintain the rhythm of the house. He would measure, trim, and mark each candle with care. Some monasteries even kept written records of how fast different types of wax burned, like scientists before the word existed. Beeswax was prized, not just for its clean flame, but for its purity. Bees were seen as sacred creatures, uncorrupted, industrious, virgin-born from the flowers themselves. Using their wax to count time felt fitting, even righteous. The monks believed the bees worked for God, and by burning their wax, they were returning that labor to heaven. The smell of beeswax and smoke became part of daily life, so constant it was almost invisible. Each brother knew its meaning, though none spoke of it. To live among candles was to live inside an ongoing reminder that even in darkness, there was order, and that every second you breathed was a flicker between two eternities. But the beauty of it all hid something darker, too. The monks' relationship with time wasn't peaceful. It was anxious. Their faith demanded discipline, perfection really, and perfection meant keeping to the schedule without fail. If the bells rang late, if the prayers started offbeat, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disruption of divine harmony. There are records of abbots punishing brothers for letting candles burn unevenly, for misjudging the hour, for losing the rhythm of the office. Imagine being scolded by your superior not for sleeping in, but for making eternity 1 minute late. Time for them was obedience. The candle was their master. And as the centuries passed, those candles multiplied, from single wax tapers to complex systems of multiple wicks, layered clocks, even mechanical candle towers that rotated as they burned. Each new design tried to perfect what was ultimately imperfect, the human attempt to measure the divine. If you asked them why they did it, the monks would have smiled and said something simple like, "Because the light must not go out." That phrase appears again and again in monastic records, in letters and sermons, "The light must not go out." It was both literal and spiritual. The flame was life, hope, and duty, all wrapped into one slow-burning moment. And as strange as it sounds, that idea would one day ignite something far beyond the monastery walls. The candle's quiet rhythm, those marks and drips and flickers, would become the blueprint for one of humanity's greatest inventions. But before we get there, let's linger a little longer in the dark. Let's stay with the monks as they breathe in wax and faith, watching the hours melt away. Because to understand how candles became clocks, we first have to understand what it felt like to live inside time before it had numbers. If you stayed in that monastery long enough, you'd start to notice something strange. The monks didn't really live in time, they lived for it. Every action, every breath, was stitched to the rhythm of bells and flame. Nothing belonged to them, not even their hours. Time belonged to God, and they were just custodians, keeping the flame honest. But time has a way of slipping its leash. In the beginning, candles were servants of devotion, burning quietly in chapels while voices hummed Latin hymns. But somewhere along the way, the monks realized that their greatest invention wasn't spiritual at all. It was practical. Those candles, marked with wax and faith, were the first reliable timekeepers Europe had ever seen. And once something can measure the invisible, people start to build rules around it. By the 12th century, the monastery wasn't just a house of prayer, it was a factory of precision. Bells rang not only for worship, but for meals, work, study, rest. Every activity had a time, and every time had a flame to match it. Even the silences had schedules. The monastery's discipline became legendary, admired and feared in equal measure. Outsiders called it Ora Day, the hours of God, but really it was the world's first timetable. Think of it this way. Before the monks, there were no hours in the sense we understand them. There were just parts of the day: dawn, morning, noon, dusk, night. Time was felt, not counted. The candle changed that. It divided the day into obedient segments, turning life into a sequence of measurable duties. And the world outside noticed. Merchants began to set their appointments by monastic bells. Laborers began to mark their shifts by their local abbey's rhythm. Travelers planned journeys around the times monks would open their gates for prayer. In a very quiet, wax-scented way, the monastery became the engine of civilization's timekeeping. But progress always has a side effect: control. If you know exactly when to start praying, then you also know exactly when to stop. Once the abbots learned that they could divide the day, they began dividing everything else. Time became moral property. Wasted hours were considered sinful, idle hands a threat to holiness. In some monasteries, even thinking outside the schedule was discouraged. There was no "I'll do it later." There was only now, and now belonged to the candle. Imagine the soundscape of a typical day. The low toll of the bell at dawn, the whisper of robes against stone, the faint hiss as a candle was snuffed and another lit. The monks never looked at a dial or a clock face. They looked at fire. And in that fire they saw order. The wax was rationed like gold. A single candle might represent an entire night of devotion. Monks measured not only the burn rate but the quality of the wick, the humidity of the air, the thickness of the walls. They took notes like scientists before there were laboratories. Some even experimented with additives. In one abbey's records, a monk describes mixing saltpeter into the wax to make the flame burn slower. Another added whale fat for longer nights. One particularly inventive brother discovered that wrapping thin parchment rings around the candle could help control airflow, a primitive thermostat. And all of this effort, the research, the precision, the endless measuring, was done in silence. Because silence was as sacred as light. The only sound was the steady crackle of fire eating through time. You could say the monks were the world's first time engineers. But they never thought of it that way. To them, every innovation was a form of devotion. Every candle improved meant fewer souls late to prayer. Every minute captured in wax meant a closer imitation of divine order. And yet, for all their discipline, they didn't fully understand what they were unleashing. The more they organized their hours, the more they taught the world that time could be owned, that it could be sold, measured, taxed, and controlled. The monastery's tidy schedule spread outward, infecting cities, armies, courts. Bells followed the trade routes. Monks became advisors to kings who envied their efficiency. And soon every town wanted its own rhythm, its own tower, its own clock, its own authority over the day. But still, the candle remained the quiet master. Outside the cloister walls, the world was chaotic. Wars, plagues, famine. Inside, everything moved with the certainty of wax. There was comfort in that, even when the world outside fell apart. In the middle of the 13th century, an anonymous chronicler wrote something beautiful in a monastery journal. When the candle burns evenly, so too does the soul. The crooked flame foretells confession. That line says everything you need to know about how they saw their world. Fire wasn't just physical. It was moral. They even trained their novices by candlelight. Young monks learned patience by tending a flame for hours, trimming the wick to keep it straight, adjusting its glow. If the light flickered or died, they had to begin again. Not because anyone would punish them, but because they'd failed the rhythm. Time wasn't a number on the wall. It was a discipline of the heart. And in that discipline, something remarkable happened: progress. By the early 14th century, someone, probably a monk, maybe an apprentice bell ringer, realized that if the candle could measure time, then perhaps a machine could remember it. The candle, after all, had one flaw. It died every day. But what if you could make something that ticked on its own, like a candle that never went out? That thought sparked a quiet revolution. In abbeys across Europe, monks began tinkering with weights, pulleys, and gears, trying to recreate the candle's slow precision with metal instead of wax. They called it the mechanical bell. But really, it was the first clock. The first recorded mechanical clock appeared in a monastery in England around 1280. It didn't have hands or a face, just a system of ropes and drums that struck a bell every hour, like a candle that had learned to ring for itself. The monks were delighted. For the first time in history, time could move without human supervision. But not everyone saw it as a blessing. Some older brothers called it the devil's bell. They said it replaced prayer with machinery, faith with counting. Others said it freed them from the candle's tyranny. Both were right in a way. The candle had once turned obedience into ritual. Now the clock turned ritual into habit. And once that habit spread beyond the cloister, it never left. The world's pulse began to change. Farmers adjusted their days to bells instead of sunrises. Cities set curfews by gears instead of clouds. Time became universal, a shared language of order. And yet, the monks never abandoned the candle completely. Even after the first clocks ticked to life, they kept their wax burning, out of reverence, out of nostalgia, maybe out of fear. Because deep down, they knew that the candle measured something the clock never could, the warmth of attention. When a candle burned, you had to be there to see it. You had to care. That's what the modern world lost when it gained the clock. It gained precision, but it lost presence. The monks would have called that irony. So as we move deeper into this story, from wax to metal, from devotion to mechanism, remember this: the first clock was born not out of impatience, but out of love. A love of order, of light, of rhythm. A desire to keep the flame alive long enough to greet the next hour. And in that flickering devotion, the world's understanding of time was about to change forever. Outside the monastery walls, the world had always followed softer clocks. The crow of a rooster, the warmth of dawn, the long blue sigh before nightfall. Nature set the tempo and people simply moved with it. But once the monasteries began ringing bells at regular intervals, something inside humanity began to tighten. The sound carried. Bells echoed across valleys, drifted over rivers, found their way into villages that had never known precision. Farmers would stop mid-field and listen. Merchants would glance at the sky, confused, and then adjust their work by the rhythm of a place they'd never seen. At first, it was just background noise, the monks doing their holy business. But slowly, the bells began to train the ear of civilization. The day was no longer a blur of tasks and seasons. It was now a series of distinct moments that could be counted, measured, and owned. Time, for the first time, had authority. And it wasn't the king or priest who ruled it, but the clock tower. If you'd stood in a medieval town square around the 14th century, you'd have heard bells from every direction. Morning mass, noon prayers, curfew. The bells didn't just organize life. They enforced it. When the evening bell rang, the taverns had to close. When the morning bell sounded, work began. Time had become a kind of invisible law, one that could be heard but not seen. The monks hadn't meant for this to happen. They built the clock for devotion, not discipline. But ideas rarely stay where they're born. The candle taught the monks to measure hours. The bell taught the world to obey them. As more cities adopted mechanical clocks, people began to lose the old seasonal rhythm. Life became narrower, more precise. The difference between soon and now became measurable. Late became a sin. And for the first time, being on time became a virtue. In many towns, the new civic clocks were treated with near religious awe. They were massive machines of iron and brass, built not for portability but permanence. No one understood how they worked, not really. They just knew that the bell rang exactly when it was supposed to. It was both comfort and control. You could say the medieval city replaced the sun with steel. There's a kind of beauty in that, humans inventing a new form of daylight, one they could regulate with gears instead of seasons. But there's also a quiet tragedy in it. The monk's candle had burned with meaning. It was alive, unpredictable, fragile. The clock was the opposite. It was cold, certain, unfeeling. A machine that didn't care who listened. And yet people adored it. Every hour was now a performance. The bell would ring, and the town would respond. Markets opening, bakers kneading, children running. For the first time, everyone's day aligned. A shared rhythm bound strangers together in invisible chains. This was progress, yes, but also submission. It didn't take long before the clock's logic began to seep into everything else. Work was divided into hours, wages calculated by time instead of product. Prayers shortened to fit tighter schedules. Even sleep began to shrink, restructured to match the new mechanical rhythm. The human body, which once followed the sun, now bowed to the clock. Time had been domesticated. There's a letter from a merchant in 1375 that captures this change perfectly. He wrote, "The bell now rules the streets as the sun once ruled the fields." He didn't mean it poetically. He meant it literally. Commerce, trade, and labor had all been synchronized. But not everyone adapted so easily. Farmers resented the rigidity. They worked by daylight, not metal. The rhythm of crops and seasons didn't care what the clock said. Some even joked that the monks' bells were city thunder, meant to frighten peasants into working faster. In a way, they weren't wrong. The clock divided humanity. Inside the walls, monks, merchants, scholars, life was measured. Outside, shepherds, fishermen, wanderers, life still flowed. It's easy to see where that split led. The mechanical clock was the seed of the Industrial Revolution. It taught humans that time was a resource, something to spend, waste, or save. But before that idea became a factory whistle, it began as a candle flame in a dark chapel. The irony is perfect. Monks, who devoted their lives to escaping the world, ended up reshaping it completely. Their quest for divine order created the framework for capitalism, science, and modern bureaucracy. But in their silence, they couldn't have imagined that one day, time itself would become currency. Still, within the monastery, life continued much as it always had. Candles burned, bells rang, prayers echoed. Outside, though, people began to treat time as something separate from faith. The sacred rhythm of hours became secular, practical, almost profane. And in that shift, something precious slipped away. A monk's candle required presence. Someone to watch it, tend it, respect it. The new clock required no one, kept going whether you looked or not. Humanity had built a self-sustaining God. You could ignore it, but it would not ignore you. The sound of bells became the heartbeat of empire. Every conquest, every law, every factory would soon march to their rhythm. And the candle, the old breathing measure of time, would fade into nostalgia, remembered only in the warm light of prayer halls. Still, the monks kept their candles burning at night. Not because they needed them anymore, but because the flame meant something deeper. It meant humility, the understanding that even the most perfect mechanism could not capture the soul of time. To them, every second was still a gift, not a schedule. If you walked through a monastery at midnight in those later centuries, you'd still find that one solitary brother sitting beside his candle, whispering psalms as the wax ran down. The bells might rule the day, but the flame still ruled the dark. It's strange how civilizations forget their beginnings. People remembered the invention of clocks, but not the devotion that made them possible. The monks, in their simplicity, had done something extraordinary. They had turned worship into measurement. And from that, the modern world was born. So as the bell replaced the candle, and the clock replaced the sun, humanity gained something dazzling, precision. But it lost something softer, peace. Because once you can count time, you can worry about losing it. And soon, the world would start worrying a lot. The monks never meant to invent anxiety. But once time could be measured, it could also be lost. And once something can be lost, humans start to worry. For centuries, people lived with time the way fish live with water. Completely immersed, completely unaware. The seasons came, the sun rose, the moon waxed and waned. Time wasn't something you counted. It was something you belonged to. But now, with bells marking the air and gears whispering behind stone walls, time had acquired weight. You could feel it pressing on you. You could be late for it. You could waste it. It was no longer a presence. It was a possession. And as soon as the world learned to possess time, it began to fear its loss. Inside the monasteries, the brothers adjusted. They'd always lived under structure. Their hours were gifts to God, not to themselves. But outside, in cities newly obsessed with commerce and craft, people began living by borrowed rhythms, schedules, shifts, contracts. The candle had been replaced by the ledger. For the first time, work began to resemble prayer, repetitive, disciplined, dictated by the clock. You could almost hear the echo of the abbey bells in the hammer of the blacksmith and the market bell announcing trade. Every toll was a sermon on productivity. The medieval city was turning into a secular monastery, and nobody noticed. Monks once divided the day into hours of prayer. Merchants divided it into hours of labor. The difference was in who received the offering. For the monks, it was God. For the townsfolk, it was gold. Either way, the day belonged to someone else. In a sense, this was progress, civilization learning the art of efficiency. But it came with a cost. When every moment has value, every silence becomes a loss. You can see it in the records of the time. Guilds began fining workers who arrived late. City bells grew louder, more frequent. Public clocks were built in squares not just to inform but to remind. Even faith began to sound mechanical. Monks who once prayed through intuition now synchronized their chants to exact intervals. God became punctual. There's something almost tragic about it. How a flame that once represented eternal devotion became the foundation for a system that worshipped speed. In the abbeys, though, the old habits lingered. Candles still flickered in the darkness. Monks still marked the passing hours by light and shadow. But even they weren't immune to the creeping precision of the world outside. Some orders began recording their daily tasks in strict ledgers. How long it took to copy a page of scripture. How much wax burned during each office. How many minutes between vespers and compline. It wasn't that they'd lost faith, they'd simply absorbed the new logic. That holiness could be measured, too. And this obsession with measurement wasn't confined to the monasteries. It seeped into science, philosophy, medicine, into everything. To understand the world, humans had decided they first had to count it. Counting was control. The monks would have called that pride. In a way, they were right. The clock gave humanity order, but it also created an illusion that order meant mastery. That if you could measure something, you could own it. But the monks knew better. They'd watched the candle. They'd seen how every measurement ended in ash. By the late 1300s, mechanical clocks began appearing in cathedrals and civic towers across Europe. Some were enormous, grand creations covered in astrological symbols and painted saints. They weren't just instruments. They were sermons in brass. Every gear was a metaphor for divine order. People would gather just to watch the automata move. Tiny carved angels striking bells, skeletons turning hourglasses. It was theater, theology, and technology in one. But as the machines became more complex, something subtle happened. People started trusting them more than themselves. Before, a monk could look at the candle and see the passing of time as a living thing, warm, human, imperfect. Now, they could look at the clock and see time as fixed, absolute, outside of them. The candle burned down. The clock went on. One died, the other endured. And humanity, perhaps for the first time, felt small in comparison to its own creation. The machine didn't need sleep, food, or faith. It simply kept going. It was dependable in a way no man could be. The monks called it faithful. The merchants called it profitable. The poets called it merciless. They were all right. In monasteries, this new reliability was both blessing and burden. The mechanical bell meant no one had to sit up all night watching a candle. But it also meant no one had to feel the passing of night anymore. The silence between hours, that sacred waiting, was gone. You see, the candle forced awareness. The clock removed it. And once time could run on its own, so could guilt. Monks began confessing not sins of passion, but of negligence. I was late to prayer. I failed to hear the bell. I missed the hour of prime. Time had become morality itself. If a man missed his hour, he'd sinned against order. And that idea that lateness could be sin spread quickly. It shaped discipline, education, even law. Punctuality became purity. Delay became corruption. Time had taken the throne of judgment. The medieval world began to divide people not by birth, but by their obedience to the clock. The reliable were trusted. The disordered were shunned. Time was the new nobility. But through it all, the monks kept their ritual. They still lit candles for every prayer. They still whispered psalms to flames that trembled like living hearts. The mechanical clock could ring the hour, but it couldn't illuminate it. Because the monks understood something modern people tend to forget. That light doesn't just reveal the world. It defines it. The candle wasn't there to tell them when to pray. It was there to remind them why they prayed. And as cities filled with ticking gears and restless ambition, the abbeys remained small islands of flame, slow, deliberate, unhurried. But that peace wouldn't last forever. Soon, even the monks would begin to question their rhythm. Because the clock's promise, its clean, endless certainty, was too seductive to resist. And as the Renaissance dawned, that certainty would become the foundation for an entirely new kind of faith. Not in God, but in time itself. The world changed its rhythm quietly, like a song slipping into a faster tempo. One day, people looked up and realized they no longer measured the day by shadows or smoke. They measured it by sound. The clock's steady beat had replaced the heartbeat of the earth. The Renaissance had arrived, a world of marble, music, and math. And in this new world, time was no longer sacred. It was solvable. The monks had once burned candles in prayer. Now scholars burned them in study. The candle had left the chapel and moved into laboratories and workshops. Wax still melted, but the light was colder, sharper, filled with calculation instead of contemplation. And the clock, that descendant of monastic silence, became the new altarpiece of civilization. In towns across Italy, France, and England, artisans built mechanical marvels that blended devotion and display. Every cathedral wanted a clock of its own. The grander, the better. The one in Strasbourg could track the planets. The one in Prague could predict the moon's phase and announce saints' days with singing figures. These machines weren't just telling time. They were preaching it. Each tick was a sermon about order, a message that the universe itself ran on divine precision. For the monks who had started it all, it was both victory and betrayal. They had built a rhythm for prayer. The world had turned it into spectacle. The candle had once burned for humility. Now it illuminated machinery that glittered like a promise. Still, inside the monasteries, old habits endured. The monks continued their slow dance with flame, marking hours by wax. They understood something the rest of the world was beginning to forget. The clock might measure time, but it couldn't sanctify it. Outside, people began to treat time as a tool. Inside, it was still a companion. You can almost imagine a winter evening in a Benedictine abbey around 1500. The mechanical bell rings on schedule, cold and perfect, while a single monk sits beside a candle that hisses as it burns. He doesn't rush. He doesn't compete with the clock. He lets the minutes dissolve in wax, the way his predecessors did centuries before. To him, the candle isn't outdated. It's honest. But he would have been in the minority. By now, Europe had fallen in love with precision. The same obsession that built clocks was about to build everything else. Maps, telescopes, printing presses, anatomy manuals. Time had become the backbone of curiosity, the belief that if you could measure something, you could understand it. Even art obeyed the new rhythm. Painters talked about capturing a moment. Composers spoke of keeping time. The language of devotion had become the language of craft. And so, quietly, the monastery's greatest gift turned into humanity's greatest addiction. Because once the world learned to count its hours, it couldn't stop. There's something tragically funny about that. The monks invented a system to bring peace, to give each day order and meaning. But the Renaissance turned that same invention into pressure. To waste time became a sin. To rest became indulgence. Every invention of progress, every gear, every chart, every experiment, required one new kind of fuel: hours. The more time people saved, the less they seemed to have. In Florence, clockmakers became celebrities. In Paris, merchants began renting time, literally. A man could pay to use another's clock, scheduling meetings or shipments down to the quarter hour. The economy had learned to monetize precision. But in the shadows of that progress, monks kept tending their candles, even as their world shrank. They'd see scholars visiting abbeys to study old manuscripts, their ink-stained fingers twitching impatiently whenever a service ran long. They'd hear whispers of new ideas, that man, not God, was the measure of all things. And they'd see how easily those same men lost track of what the measure was for. Because once time became mechanical, it also became moral in a new way. Punctuality was no longer just discipline, it was identity. To be modern was to be on time. To be late was to be old, backward, lazy. The clock divided not just hours, but people. And so, the monks, who had once been at the cutting edge of invention, found themselves on the wrong side of progress. You can almost picture the irony. A young scholar mocking the monks for using candles to track hours, while the candle he mocked by melts just fast enough to show how fleeting his own enlightenment is. But history has a sense of humor that way. Even as the Renaissance worshipped light, it forgot the meaning of burning. The monks never forgot. They understood what the new thinkers couldn't see. That measurement is not mastery. You can know the time without knowing what it's for. By the mid-1500s, the candle clock had vanished from most monasteries, replaced by the bell towers and the chiming of gears. The candles still burned, of course, but only for ritual, not for reckoning. Their old purpose had gone quiet, like a saint who'd retired from miracles. And yet, there's something poetic about that end. Because even as the candles surrendered their role, they left behind a kind of ghost. Every flicker of light in the New Age, from lanterns to gas lamps to electricity, was a descendant of that first flame measured in faith. The world had traded devotion for discovery, but the fire was the same. In every lab where a scholar studied motion, in every studio where an artist painted light, in every forge where metal met heat, the candle's lesson survived. That time and illumination are not separate things. That to see is to count, and to count is to believe in order. The monks had set out to make each hour holy. The world, in its own restless way, made each hour useful. Maybe that's the only difference between faith and progress. Intention. Because the Renaissance didn't reject the monk's candle, it only repurposed it. It burned the same flame for a different god. The old light of devotion became the new light of reason, and both, in their own ways, were prayers to permanence. The irony is that both were chasing the same impossible thing, to make time stand still. And as we move deeper into this story, that desire to capture time, to cage it, to master it, will begin to consume everything. Because once you can measure every second, the next temptation is to control them all. And no one understood that better than the men who built the first public clocks, monuments not just to time but to power. Part 6. The Towers That Ruled the Sky. By the 16th century, Europe had become a forest of bells. Every town, every city, every monastery had its own rhythm, its own mechanical heartbeat that rang through the air like prayer disguised as precision. But while the monasteries had built clocks for order, the cities built them for power. The great clock towers rose like sermons in stone. They were tall enough to remind you who owned the hours, loud enough to drown out the countryside, and precise enough to make you feel late even when you weren't. For the first time, time itself had a skyline. The monks had measured the day in devotion. The merchants measured it in profit. The kings, however, measured it in obedience. When a city built a clock tower, it wasn't just announcing progress, it was declaring control. The bells didn't just mark the hours, they marked authority. To hear a bell was to be reminded that someone, somewhere, was keeping count. The sound itself became law. Standing in a medieval square as the hour struck must have been a kind of awe that bordered on fear. The bells shook the air, rattled your ribs, echoed in the stone. People stopped talking mid-sentence. Horses flinched. Pigeons scattered. For a moment, the entire city moved in sync, united not by belief, but by sound. In Florence, in Bruges, in Prague, people began to describe their cities in terms of their clocks. We rise with the bell, they'd say, and we sleep when it stops. It was the heartbeat of the civic body, a mechanical soul made of brass and rope. The monks, who had once kept the rhythm of faith, now found that their rhythm had been replaced by something colder. They no longer owned time. They served it. The bell that had once called them to prayer now called the baker, the butcher, the bureaucrat. And in a way, that was the beginning of modern life, the moment when time became a public resource instead of a private rhythm. The early clock towers were wonders of engineering. Inside them were forests of gears and counterweights, pendulums swinging like metal incense burners. The clockmakers themselves were treated like magicians, their workshops smelling of oil and smoke. People said they had discovered the secret of the universe, the divine ratio that made the heavens move. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The clock didn't mimic the heavens, it replaced them. For thousands of years, people had looked to the stars to understand their place in the world. The constellations were timekeepers, storytellers, guides. But the clock tower told a different story, one of control instead of wonder. You didn't have to look up anymore. You only had to listen, and listening meant obeying. It was no coincidence that governments loved clocks. Kings used them to coordinate armies. Merchants used them to schedule taxes. Churches used them to remind the faithful that salvation had a timetable. Even punishment became punctual, executions performed at noon, confessions timed to the hour. Time, once sacred, had been bureaucratized. In the monasteries, the old candle clocks still flickered inside chapels. The monks clung to them as symbols of humility, even as they wound the great mechanisms in their towers. They tended both fires, one that burned, one that ticked. Imagine the sound of that balance. A bell tolling above, a candle crackling below. One eternal, one dying. Together they formed the soundscape of the Middle Ages. But as the towers multiplied, the monks began to fade from the story. The world no longer needed their quiet precision. Towns hired secular clock-keepers, craftsmen who knew nothing of prayer but everything of pulleys. They lived in the towers themselves, sleeping beside their machines like guardians of time. Every dawn, they'd climb ladders to wind the great iron drums, their hands blackened by oil and soot. And as they worked, the city below moved like clockwork. Markets opening, workshops filling, children herded to lessons. Time was now infrastructure. The candle had become irrelevant. Yet for all its efficiency, the clock tower carried a strange melancholy. It was beautiful, yes, but in the way that cages are beautiful, symmetrical, polished, inescapable. Time had been set free from the candle's flicker only to be trapped in gears. There's an old phrase from a monk's chronicle in Chartres that captures this transition perfectly. The bell does not pray, it only reminds. That line feels almost like a lament. The monks had created a rhythm that once felt alive, and now it echoed without meaning. The machine could do their job perfectly, but perfection is a poor substitute for devotion. And yet humanity pressed on. By the 17th century, cities were competing for the most elaborate clocks. Some told the positions of planets. Others displayed the phases of the moon, the tides, even the length of the coming day. The clocks became maps of the cosmos carved in metal, as if man could outdo creation by reproducing it. And in a strange way they did. The mechanical clock became a metaphor for the universe itself. Philosophers began calling the cosmos the divine clockwork, and God the great clockmaker. It was a comforting image, an orderly universe, predictable, measurable, safe. But the monks who remembered the candle knew that safety is not the same as grace. The candle had always reminded them that time was fragile, inconsistent, human. The clock promised eternity, but eternity made no room for mercy. In the candlelight, you could still see your reflection tremble on the wall. In the clock's brass, there was no reflection at all. And so, even as the towers ruled the cities, a quiet resistance flickered in the monasteries and churches that still burned wax instead of oil. The monks didn't fight the machines. They simply refused to let the flame die, because they understood that no matter how precise the gears, the human soul doesn't keep perfect time. They had lived long enough to know, the moment you start counting your hours too carefully, you stop living them. As Europe entered the age of empires and science, the bell towers kept ringing. Time had become universal, audible proof that the world had conquered its chaos. But for those who remembered the candle's softer light, that conquest felt a little too quiet, a little too cold. And as the centuries turned, people began to wonder if they'd traded mystery for management. The monks, still tending their little flames, might have smiled sadly at that. They'd always known that time was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be kept. By the time the 17th century exhaled into the 18th, the sound of bells had become the background hum of civilization. The clock tower no longer amazed anyone. It simply existed, like gravity or guilt. You couldn't escape it even if you wanted to. But the next transformation was even quieter. It didn't happen in towers or monasteries. It happened in pockets. The first portable clocks, heavy brass contraptions no bigger than a loaf of bread, began to appear in the hands of the wealthy. Nobles wore them on chains, scholars kept them on desks, and ship captains treated them like relics. They were still unreliable, but they gave something the great towers never could: the illusion of personal control. You no longer had to listen for time. You could carry it. And that, oddly enough, is when humanity invented lateness. Because until then, there was no such thing as being on time. There was only being present. The sun rose, you worked. The bell rang, you prayed. The rhythm was communal, not personal. But once people could own clocks, time stopped being a shared experience and became a private burden. Now it was possible to be wrong about time, to lose it, to run out of it. The candle had been forgiving. It melted whether you were watching or not. The pocket watch, however, demanded attention. You had to wind it, check it, obsess over its tiny heartbeat. For the first time in history, the anxiety of punctuality was portable. And so, the monk's old discipline of obedience became everyone's daily ritual. In London, the early watchmakers worked in dim shops that smelled of oil and brass, their windows filled with delicate ticking hearts made of springs and gears. Time had become a commodity, something you could buy, polish, display. But it was also something you could break. And that made it human again. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Preachers began warning about the sin of idleness, a phrase that spread like wildfire through Protestant Europe. The candle's lesson of presence was replaced by a doctrine of productivity. To waste time was to insult God's generosity. To rest was to risk damnation. It's almost funny how something born in silence and prayer turned into an engine of guilt. Monks once watched candles for devotion. Now merchants watched watches for fear. The moral of timekeeping had inverted completely. What began as a rhythm of peace became a race no one could win. By the 18th century, the watch had become both a symbol of success and a measure of character. A man with a fine timepiece was trustworthy. A man without one was suspect. Even language began to shift. People didn't arrive. They kept appointments. Lives became schedules written in ink. And underneath it all was that quiet hum of anxiety that still haunts us today. The fear of being late, of falling behind, of losing the one thing you can't replace. If you told a monk from the 13th century that people would one day apologize for losing time, he'd have laughed. Not cruelly, but gently. He would have said something like, "How can you lose what you do not own?" But the modern world had stopped listening to monks. It was too busy counting. Meanwhile, the candle, the old keeper of the hours, was still burning, but in a different kind of devotion. In private homes, in taverns, in ships' cabins, people burned candles to mark their nights. The wax that once measured prayers now measured stories, letters, quarrels, and loneliness. The light had left the chapel, but it hadn't lost its meaning. There's something universal about that small flame. Fragile, temporary, defiant. The monks had used it to make time holy. The modern world used it to make time visible. The difference is that the monks saw the candle as part of eternity. The modern mind saw it as a countdown. As mechanical timekeeping spread, so did the sense that life itself could be organized like a clock. Governments began issuing schedules. Factories began setting shifts. The industrial world was being born, and its mother was the monk's candle, reinvented as the machine's heartbeat. It's strange to think that the bell towers, those massive structures of faith, ended up training humanity for factory whistles. The monks who once rang bells for prayer had unknowingly written the script for the modern workday. You can almost hear the echo of it now. The factory siren at dawn, the lunch whistle at noon, the closing bell at dusk. It's just the old monastic rhythm in a louder key. But what the monks had done for love, the world now did for profit. And with that shift came a new kind of suffering. Workers in cities like Manchester or Lyon described time as a master that never sleeps. Their lives were measured in minutes, their worth calculated by output per hour. The candle's gentle flicker had turned into the relentless tick of the machine. Time no longer belonged to God, or even to nature. It belonged to employers, governments, systems. And yet, in the quiet corners of that new mechanical world, people still lit candles. Not to measure anything, but to remember. A candle on a desk during a long night of study. A candle by a sickbed. A candle in a church where someone had forgotten how to pray. The monks would have recognized those flames, even if the people who lit them didn't. Because somewhere deep down, humanity still remembered that time isn't just something to manage. It's something to witness. The clock may have made life faster, but the candle still made it visible. And as the world rushed forward, a few quiet souls began to wonder whether progress and peace could truly share the same hour. The monks could have told them the answer. They knew that time, like wax, only burns beautifully when you stop trying to control the flame. But the world wasn't listening anymore. It had already begun winding itself tighter, chasing precision until even the sky felt scheduled. And soon that obsession would reach its peak. The ticking of time would become so exact, so absolute, that it would finally shatter the illusion the monks had built, the illusion that order brings peace. Because the closer humans came to mastering time, the more they began to realize time was mastering them. By the dawn of the 19th century, time had grown teeth. What the monks once whispered to their candles, the rhythm of prayer, the sanctity of each hour, had been swallowed by industry. The soft tolling of monastery bells had turned into the harsh whistle of steam engines. The clock tower still stood, but now it ruled over smokestacks instead of steeples. In the cities, the air itself seemed to tick. Factories ran on precise schedules measured by iron clocks mounted high on soot-blackened walls. Workers filed in at dawn, their footsteps echoing like ritual. They didn't need to see the clock to know what hour it was. They could feel it in their bones. The bell would ring, the machines would start, and the day would begin again, identical to the one before. Time was no longer measured. It was consumed. The monks had once offered their hours to God. Now humanity offered them to the machine. The Industrial Revolution was many things: innovation, progress, ambition, but above all, it was the victory of measured time over lived time. Everything ran on schedules: trains, telegraphs, factories, schools, even sleep. Time had become a grid laid over life, and people were expected to fit neatly inside its boxes. And for most, there was no choice. A weaver in Manchester or a miner in Prussia might work 14 hours under gaslight, returning home long after the sun had forgotten their faces. Their bodies moved mechanically, their breaths in sync with the hiss of steam and the grind of gears. It was devotion without faith, a form of prayer dictated by profit. The candle, once the companion of the monk, was still there in those factories, but smaller, humbler, reduced to a stub burned down to nothing in a corner. It gave just enough light for a foreman to sign his ledgers. No one watched it for meaning anymore. It simply existed, unnoticed, melting quietly as men and women tried to keep up with the clock. In those dim workshops, you could say that the candle and the worker had traded places. Both burned out to keep the machine alive. The strange part is that this new devotion to time didn't feel cruel at first. Felt righteous. Efficiency was the new holiness. Being early was virtue. Resting was sin. Even religion began to adopt the new vocabulary. Preachers thundered about the moral duty of hard work and the sin of wasting the day. The monks' ancient discipline had become the modern world's obsession. But this version of discipline had no silence in it, no room for stillness or grace. The clock didn't forgive lateness. The machine didn't stop for prayer. The hour wasn't holy anymore. It was owned. There's a diary entry from a factory overseer in 1832 that reads, almost casually, "We added a second shift to save daylight." It sounds reasonable, efficient even, but it also marks the moment when humanity started trying to outpace the sun. The monks once adjusted their candles to the seasons. Now the seasons adjusted to production. Time had become something to exploit. Of course, the irony is that the Industrial Revolution owed its very existence to the same kind of patience that industry destroyed. The candle that taught monks to measure time had also taught them to work with it, slowly, carefully, rhythmically. But the machine had no rhythm. It had pace. And pace is something you chase until it kills you. The workers, exhausted and soot-streaked, began describing themselves as living clocks. Their bosses, meanwhile, spoke of buying time. It was more than metaphor, it was economics. The factory owner didn't just purchase labor. He purchased hours. The candle that once marked devotion had become a receipt. It's easy to forget how radical that shift was. For most of human history, time was shared, a communal experience tied to weather, bells, daylight. But in the 1800s, time became private property. Every man's hours were his own, but also for sale. That was the world's great paradox. Time became more valuable the less of it you had. The monks would have called that heresy. They believed time was sacred because it was fleeting, not because it could be spent. To sell your hours would have sounded like selling your soul. And yet, in a sense, that's what people did. Factories didn't just reshape cities, they reshaped the human imagination. People began to think of life itself in terms of productivity. Childhood became preparation. Rest became waste. Even death was reframed as running out of time. The clock had completed its transformation. It was no longer a tool. It was a master. Still, the old light of the candle flickered in small corners of resistance. In poor homes and boarding houses, workers lit candles at night to steal back time that the factory had taken. They'd use those stolen hours to read, write letters, dream. The candle became a quiet rebellion, a protest made of flame. One textile worker wrote in her journal, "They have my daylight, but they cannot have my night." That sentence feels almost like a prayer, a continuation of the monk's devotion, but rewritten for a world that had forgotten how to pray. In that small, flickering light, time became personal again. For a few moments, people could stop counting. They could just exist. But those moments were rare. As cities expanded and trains connected countries, time had to be standardized. The clock tower that once ruled a single town now ruled continents. In 1884, delegates from across the world gathered in Washington, D.C., to establish global time zones, a system that divided the planet into neat slices of obedience. It was the final triumph of precision. The world had synchronized its heartbeat. And yet, even as they carved the globe into hours, something essential slipped through the cracks. The monk's candle had once connected time to meaning, to the rhythm of prayer, of sunrise, of breath. The new world had replaced meaning with measurement. You could know exactly what hour it was anywhere on Earth, but you might not know why you cared. Still, the candle survived. You'd find it on writing desks, in ships' cabins, in factory windows where workers still labored long after dark. It no longer measured time, but it remembered it. That small, wavering light was the last echo of the old rhythm. The reminder that time, for all its precision, is still something that burns. And maybe that's why we still light candles today. For birthdays, vigils, prayer. Not to count, but to remember. The monks might have smiled at that. They would have seen in every candle flame the same quiet truth they discovered centuries before. That time, no matter how it's measured, still ends in smoke. And that the only thing that makes it holy is how you choose to spend the light. For thousands of years, people worked when the sun allowed, rested when it didn't, and prayed somewhere in between. Time was an organic thing, a pulse in the soil, in the weather, in the body. But the Industrial Revolution had broken that rhythm. It wound the world too tightly. So tightly, in fact, that something had to give. And what gave way was the strangest invention of all, leisure. You might think of leisure as something ancient, a simple pleasure of the human condition. But in truth, it's a modern creation, a survival mechanism for a world that no longer knew how to stop. Before clocks ruled, there was no such thing as free time. There was just time. Life was work and rest, woven together like breath and heartbeat. The peasants who worked the fields had feast days and festivals. Yes, but those weren't time off. They were simply part of the rhythm of existence. Moments of joy folded naturally into labor. But when time became a commodity, it could be divided. Bought, sold, earned. The candle in the monastery had never earned its light. It burned because that was its nature. But the factory worker had to buy his own hours back from the machine, tiny fragments of the day he could call his own. And that, ironically, was the birth of freedom. At least, that's what they told themselves. The first leisure hours were not graceful. They were exhausted. Men stumbled out of factories with eyes full of soot and bones full of fatigue. The world outside smelled of iron and smoke, but it was still outside. For the first time in their lives, people had moments that weren't accounted for, blank spaces between shifts. And the emptiness terrified them, because what do you do with time that doesn't belong to anyone? Some turned to drink. Taverns filled in the evenings, the air thick with laughter that sounded more like relief than joy. Others turned to religion again, searching for meaning in the stillness that followed the factory bell. Families gathered around candles not for prayer, but for stories. And gradually, humanity rediscovered something the monks had always known: that idleness is not sin when it has soul. Leisure was not laziness, it was remembrance. In those brief, borrowed hours, people began to feel human again. They took walks, they read, they sang. They built small rituals of rest to remind themselves that they were not just extensions of gears. Of course, the system noticed. It always does. Soon, leisure became its own industry. Parks were built, theaters opened, seaside resorts appeared like new cathedrals for the working class. But even these, for all their beauty, were still governed by the clock. You had to schedule your rest. That was the world's quiet tragedy. Even freedom had a timetable. And yet, something remarkable was happening underneath it all. The same precision that had enslaved people to time also began freeing them from it. Machines took over the hardest labor. Transportation became faster. Communication became instant. Time, once something to fight against, began to bend to human will again. You can almost imagine a candle flickering in approval, its old lesson glowing faintly in the corner of a mechanized world. The monks would have recognized the pattern. Struggle, control, surrender, rediscovery. Humanity was, in its own chaotic way, repeating the rhythm of prayer. Every revolution needs rest. Every machine needs silence between its beats. The candle had taught that long ago. Still, there was a difference between the monks' quiet rest and the industrial world's noisy leisure. The monks rested to connect with eternity. Modern people rested to escape the clock. In a way, it was the same prayer but said backwards. One of the great ironies of progress is that every attempt to master time ends up creating more of it. The world had gained hours but lost ease. People now lived longer but hurried more. Every invention promised to save time: railroads, telegraphs, typewriters, and every one of them filled that saved time with new obligations. It's almost poetic. Humanity created clocks to make sense of the hours, then created leisure to survive them. You can trace the shift in the simplest of things: candles. In the monasteries, a candle marked the sacred hours. In the factories, it illuminated endless labor. In the homes of clerks and seamstresses, it became something gentler again, a light for the hours after the day's work, when people finally returned to themselves. There's a painting from 1845 that captures this beautifully. A small family gathered around a table, their faces lit by candlelight. The father is reading aloud. The mother is sewing. The children listen. Behind them, through the window, a factory chimney glows against the dark. Two worlds sharing the same flame. That's the paradox of time in the modern age. It divides us and unites us all at once. The monks would have called that a mystery. The philosophers of the 19th century called it the burden of progress. Either way, it meant the same thing. Humanity was still chasing peace in the same direction it had lost it. But amid all the noise, Some people began to look backward, to the old rhythms, the old silences. The Romantics wrote poems about twilight and solitude. Painters filled canvases with candlelight again, soft and trembling, as if the flame itself were trying to remind them of something. Time was mechanical now, but the heart still wasn't. In the quiet moments, people began to feel it again, the sense that life's worth couldn't be measured by the clock, only by the candle. And for the first time in centuries, that idea began to spread again. It whispered through art, through philosophy, through the simplest act of sitting still. Progress had built a world that moved faster than the soul could walk. But the monks, had they still been there to speak, might have smiled and said, "Don't worry, the flame will slow you down, because no matter how far you run, a candle only burns one speed. It flickers, it breathes, it ends. And in that ending, it teaches something no clock ever can, that the point of time isn't to measure life, it's to feel it." For almost all of human history, night had been a wall. When the sun sank, life slowed. The world dimmed to embers and whispers. The candle was the final authority, the one small defiance against darkness, flickering gently as if to remind people that they were still here, still human, still waiting for dawn. Then, almost without ceremony, that rhythm died. Gaslight came first. In the early 19th century, cities began replacing oil lamps and candles with pipes of manufactured gas, fed into iron lanterns that glowed with a steady, artificial flame. It was revolutionary and unsettling. People could now walk through the streets at midnight and see everything as if it were still dusk. Shadows no longer belonged to the night, they belonged to the city. The monks would have found it blasphemous. They had spent centuries teaching that light was sacred, that darkness was necessary for reflection. But here it was light without limit, night without meaning. The candle, which had once measured hours by its own sacrifice, now looked fragile beside these unending flames that required no tending, no faith, no watcher. And yet, for all its brilliance, the new light changed humanity in ways no one expected. Shops stayed open longer. Factories added night shifts. Streets never truly slept. People worked, bought, wandered. The ancient contract between daylight and rest was broken. Time at last had escaped the body. In London, where gaslight spread fastest, the night became something new, a spectacle. Gentlemen strolled through parks that glowed with steady halos of yellow. Theaters gleamed with chandeliers that never flickered. Newspapers called it permanent day. The city looked awake, but not alive, because when the night lost its mystery, people lost their stillness. The monk's candle had demanded attention. You had to sit with it, to feel its warmth, to notice the tiny changes in its flame. Gaslight asked for nothing. It burned perfectly, impersonally, for everyone and no one. It made night efficient. Efficiency, by now, had become humanity's favorite prayer. But even that wasn't enough. By the end of the century, gaslight was fading, replaced by something brighter still, electricity. When Thomas Edison's bulbs first illuminated a factory floor in 1880, newspapers called it a miracle. "The darkness conquered," one headline said. People gathered just to stare at the glowing filaments, mesmerized by their steadiness. No wax, no smoke, no silence. And that was the moment the world finally forgot how to sleep. The candle's rhythm had once linked humanity to the natural order. The slow alternation of light and dark, work and rest, day and night. But electricity erased that rhythm. Factories no longer needed dawn. Writers could labor until sunrise. Children read by light that never died. The world's pulse quickened, and no one knew how to slow it down. It was intoxicating, dangerous, beautiful. The same cities that had once been ghostly after sundown now gleamed like constellations. The night sky grew dimmer, but the streets shone brighter than ever before. The stars were replaced by bulbs, the sky by ceiling, and under that new light, humanity changed its relationship with time again. The candle had taught patience. Electricity taught impatience. The candle burned down. The bulb could be replaced instantly. The candle whispered. The bulb hummed. The candle required presence. The bulb required only a switch. It was progress, yes, but progress that came at the cost of intimacy. Imagine, for a moment, the last monk in some forgotten abbey, watching the new electric towers rise over a distant town. He would see the glow spilling across the hills, erasing the stars, and he might murmur the same line that had been whispered in monasteries for centuries. Even the brightest light casts a shadow, because the truth was simple: when night disappeared, so did reflection. The candle had always measured the inner life as much as the outer. Its small flame had stood for focus, for prayer, for the delicate balance between mortality and meaning. But now, with endless light, the night was no longer a place of meditation. It was just more time to fill. People worked through it, talked through it, forgot that stillness had once been sacred. It's telling that the word nightlife first appeared in this period. It didn't mean peace. It meant escape. People sought in entertainment what they had lost in silence. The candle's quiet communion became the electric city's carnival. And though the world celebrated this victory over darkness, something inside humanity dimmed. Writers began to notice. Poets mourned the death of the stars. Painters turned away from sunlight and began painting lamps instead. Cold, unblinking orbs against a world that had forgotten how to rest. There's a painting from 1903 by Pissarro that shows a Paris street under electric light. The colors are soft, golden, almost holy, but the people look blurred, ghost-like. It's as if the light itself has made them less human. That's what the monks would have recognized. The difference between being illuminated and being exposed. The candle illuminated. It invited reflection, intimacy, quiet. The electric light exposed. It made everything visible at once. And when everything is visible, nothing is sacred. Still, progress moved on, unbothered by sentiment. Candles became decoration, symbols of nostalgia, romance, remembrance. They were lit not for necessity, but for memory. A way of pretending for a few minutes that time could still be soft. Even now, when we light candles in churches, at dinners, on birthdays, we are unconsciously returning to that older rhythm. The flicker is the heartbeat we forgot. The monks would have smiled at that, too. They would have seen it as proof that the human spirit, no matter how electrified, still hungers for warmth that cannot be switched on. Because no matter how far we go, or how bright our cities become, there's still something in us that only wakes when the lights go out. The world had conquered the night, but in doing so, it had conquered part of itself. And the candle, patient as ever, waited quietly for darkness to return. Part 11: The Age of Borrowed Seconds. By the 20th century, time had become too precise to be human. The monks had once divided the day into hours for prayer, soft and uneven, guided by light. Now, humanity divided the second into fractions so small they could barely be imagined. Scientists measured pulses of energy. Factories timed assembly lines to the 10th of a minute. Trains departed with a whistle, ships with a bell, and people began to live in fear of missing both. The candle's old lesson, that time was something to tend, had become something to track. The 20th century was the first era to experience what philosophers called temporal pressure. Everyone felt it, though few could name it. There was no silence between the ticks anymore, no soft pause between moments. The clock no longer told the hour, it commanded it. And yet, for all that control, people were more lost in time than ever. The new machines of the modern world ran faster than the human mind could follow. Cars blurred through streets, trains cut through landscapes, telegrams crossed oceans in minutes. The speed was thrilling and terrifying. For the first time, people could travel faster than their own sense of time could adjust. The world was shrinking, but the hours felt shorter. That was the paradox of progress. The more time you saved, the less you had. Factories introduced the time card, a small, simple piece of paper stamped at the start and end of every shift. It was supposed to make life fairer, more organized. But to those who lived by it, it felt more like a brand. Each punch of the clock was a reminder. Your hours are not your own. You can almost imagine the monks, looking down from some distant heaven, shaking their heads. They had once given their time freely as devotion. Now, time was rented by the hour, sold by the minute, measured by machines. Still, the candle survived, but in new places. You found it not in abbeys now, but in homes during power outages, or on dinner tables where people tried to remember warmth. The candle had gone from a tool to a symbol of memory, of comfort, of something slower than the world had become. Wars came, and with them a new kind of time, military time. Hours divided not for prayer or work, but for survival. 0, 600, 1200, 1800. Precision became defense. Delay became death. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers wrote about the strange way time felt before battle, how every second stretched thin and trembling. And then, in the chaos, how whole hours vanished in an instant. The candle would have understood that, too. How time burns unevenly, faster when it matters most. After the wars, when the machines of industry returned to peace, people began to fear stillness. Factories filled again, but now with clocks that glowed in the dark, painted with radium so even the night couldn't escape them. The workers who painted them, young women called the radium girls, licked their brushes to make finer points, unaware that the glow was killing them. They had brought light to timekeeping and paid for it with their lives. It's hard not to think of that as the final, cruel echo of the monk's candle. Light and death, intertwined once again. Meanwhile, scientists were dissecting time itself. In 1905, Einstein published his theory of relativity and quietly broke the universe's clock. He showed that time was not fixed, not absolute, but elastic, different for each observer, bent by gravity, stretched by speed. In other words, even at its most mechanical, time was still a kind of mystery. The monks would have smiled. They'd been saying that all along. But the modern world didn't want mystery. It wanted mastery. Atomic clocks soon replaced pendulums. Seconds became so precise they were defined by vibrations of cesium atoms. Humanity had measured time down to the heartbeat of matter itself, and in doing so had lost track of its own. The candle, of course, couldn't care less. It still burned at its own pace, unaffected by relativity or revolution. In a world of roaring engines and glowing filaments, it became a gentle act of rebellion. Writers used it as a symbol of memory. Lovers lit them to slow down time. In an age obsessed with seconds, a candle became the one object that refused to hurry. You could say it was the last honest clock left. Because no matter how advanced the world became, how synchronized, how global, time still ended the same way, in fading light. By mid-century, cities pulsed with neon and power grids. Nights were no longer dark enough for stars, let alone reflection. The monk's rhythm had disappeared completely, but people started to feel the emptiness of endless light. They missed the shadows. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote in 1949 that a candle is private light. He meant that in a world of shared electricity, the candle's glow belonged only to you. It was small, personal, unrepeatable, like a heartbeat. The light of technology illuminated everything. The light of a candle illuminated someone. And maybe that's why, even in the most mechanized age in history, we still light candles for grief. When words fail, when time feels too cruel or fast to comprehend, we reach for the oldest kind of clock. One that burns down slowly, silently, in defiance of precision. In that tiny flame, the world's obsession with control softens. The same way the monks once whispered prayers to the passing of wax, we whisper our own, grateful, fearful, hopeful, watching time turn into smoke. Because even now, after all these centuries of invention and measurement, the candle still reminds us of something profound. That time isn't a machine. It's a life. And when you light a candle, you're not just fighting darkness. You're giving time permission to be beautiful again. Part 12, The Light That Never Sleeps. By the late 20th century, the world had achieved what the monks had never intended and what the industrialists had only dreamed of: the complete annihilation of darkness. It began quietly, as all great shifts do, with a soft blue glow. Computer screens, television sets, digital clocks blinking in red numerals. The light wasn't fire anymore. It wasn't even warm. It didn't flicker or fade. It glowed cold and constant, humming softly in the corners of rooms long after everyone had gone to bed. The candle had been alive. The bulb had been steady. But the screen was endless. For centuries, humanity had tried to escape the limits of daylight. Now it had succeeded and instantly regretted it. The monks, sitting in their stone cells by candlelight, could never have imagined this kind of illumination. Light without shadow, time without pause. To them, the candle's flame had been both clock and companion. A reminder that time's passing was gentle, inevitable, and worth noticing. The new light gave the opposite message. Stay awake, stay busy, stay connected. The digital age had no matins or vespers, no division between work and rest. Time had become fluid, like electricity itself. Always flowing, never stopping, always demanding to be seen. Even sleep, that ancient cathedral of silence, began to collapse. By the 1980s, people were bragging about how little they needed. "I'll sleep when I'm dead" became a slogan, a badge of honor for a civilization that had forgotten how to sit still. The monks had spent centuries training their minds to exist inside time. The modern world spent decades trying to outrun it. And the strangest part? The faster people moved, the less they felt. Technology had promised to free humanity from monotony, but in truth, it only rearranged it. Instead of bells and candles, we had alarms and notifications. Instead of monastic hours, we had schedules and reminders. The rhythm was the same. It had just lost its soul. If you look closely, you can see the ghost of the monastery in every modern office. The desks lined in rows, the glowing lights overhead, the rigid schedules, the quiet hum of machines. The monks had invented routine as a path to transcendence. We reinvented it as productivity. Different gods, same prayers. And yet, amid all the wires and light, the candle refused to die. It reappeared where you least expect it, on dinner tables, in places of mourning, in moments of quiet. When the power goes out, we reach for it instinctively. That small, trembling flame feels more real than all the light bulbs in the world. Because it is real. It moves. It breathes. It reminds us that light once required sacrifice. The monks would have nodded knowingly. They'd have said, "You've made light infinite," but meaning was never meant to be infinite. The digital age, for all its brilliance, struggles with that truth. When the monks measured time, they accepted its end. They watched their candles melt and saw in that loss a reflection of themselves. Modern light never melts, it just burns forever, indifferent. We've gained eternity but lost closure. There's a strange emptiness in that. You can see it in the quiet hours after midnight, when the world glows with a million tiny lights. Screens, routers, signs, machines, all still awake, all waiting for no one. The monk's darkness, which once invited reflection, has been replaced by perpetual visibility. Everything is illuminated, but nothing is truly seen. We don't mark time anymore. We scroll through it. Every flick of a finger is another candle snuffed out, another hour forgotten. The screen gives us endless light, endless motion, endless distraction, but almost no awareness of the passing hours. The monks would have called that blindness by brightness. And yet, it's not hopeless, because even now, in this sleepless age, humanity still lights candles. In cathedrals, on birthdays, vigils, each flame a small rebellion against the cold infinity of digital light. Each one whispering, "This hour matters." In a world where time has become invisible, the candle makes it visible again. You can almost imagine a monk from the 12th century walking into a modern room lit by computer screens. He'd be startled, maybe awed, but then he'd see a single candle on a desk, burning quietly beside all that circuitry. And he'd understand. He'd smile, because in that one small light, the rhythm still survives. The glow of the screen may dominate the world, but the candle still carries the truth. That time is not a line, it's a flame. It burns differently for everyone. It consumes itself as it gives. And when it ends, it leaves warmth in its wake. Even now, in a century that pretends to live outside of time, we still keep the oldest ritual alive. We light a candle for someone gone, for someone lost, for something we cannot name. And in that gesture, we echo the first monk who ever watched wax melt and thought, "This is how the soul measures its days." It's not nostalgia. It's memory, because every age has its light, but only one ever teaches you to watch it fade. And maybe that's why, after all these centuries, we still need candles. Not for brightness, but for limits. Not to see the world, but to remind ourselves that we don't last forever. And that's what makes us beautiful. It's strange, isn't it? After all the centuries of invention, all the engines and algorithms and artificial suns, humanity somehow finds its way back to the smallest source of light. A single candle. It's there in every age. Quiet, familiar, patient. When the electricity fails, we reach for it. When grief visits, we light it. When joy returns, we set it on a cake and call it celebration. We've built towers, telescopes, satellites, machines that can split atoms and map galaxies, but none of them replace what that one fragile flame still does. It gives time a body. The monks would have said it gives time a soul. Back then, each candle in the monastery was a living clock, one that burned at the same pace as a heartbeat. It wasn't perfect, and that was precisely the point. Its imprecision made every moment personal. The wax didn't care about the laws of mechanics. It followed the laws of nature. Heat, air, breath. Every hour was a small surrender. Now, surrounded by lights that never flicker, we've begun to miss that imperfection. The digital world glows evenly, but it never warms. Its light doesn't fade gently. It blinks off. Its time doesn't flow, it resets. You can't feel the seconds passing. You can only count them. That's why the candle feels like a miracle now. Not because it's old, but because it moves at a human pace. Watch it closely and you'll see what the monks saw, a kind of breathing. The flame rises and falls, stretches and folds, reacts to every whisper of air. It's alive in a way that machines aren't. When you sit beside it, the world slows down enough for your thoughts to catch up. That's what the monks understood better than anyone. That time wasn't meant to be chased. It was meant to be kept company. For them, lighting a candle wasn't about illumination. It was about attention. It meant saying to the hour, "I see you passing, and I choose to be here while you do." That's a rhythm the modern world has almost forgotten. We live in an age of multitasking and microseconds, of calendars that fill themselves and clocks that live in our pockets. We measure time so precisely that we barely feel it anymore. And yet, Every time someone strikes a match and lights a candle, the entire history of human timekeeping flickers back to life. The monk's discipline, the clockmaker's obsession, the industrial worker's fatigue. It all ends here, in this small act of remembering. Because the candle doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't beep or buzz or demand interaction. It just burns quietly until it can't anymore. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. A monk from the 1200s and a programmer from the 2020s could both sit beside the same candle and feel the same truth. That time, at its core, is not mechanical. It's mortal. The candle's rhythm is the body's rhythm, the slow surrender of fuel to flame, of breath to air. That's what makes it so timeless. It burns the way we live. Slowly, imperfectly, beautifully. You can see why artists never stopped painting it. The candle's light is both beginning and ending. It's birth and decay in one gesture. In a single flame, you can see the whole arc of a lifetime. The monks never set out to create that symbolism. They were just trying to stay awake for prayers. But maybe that's the secret to all human invention. We build tools to survive, and only later realize we were really building metaphors. The candle clock was never about measuring time. It was about witnessing it. That's why, even in our world of glowing screens, we still crave its company. People light candles when they meditate, when they mourn, when they try to remember something sacred or simply slow down. Deep down, we still understand that to live meaningfully means to live by the flame, not the clock. Because the clock tells you how much time you have left. The candle shows you how it disappears. And somehow that's less frightening. The monks would have recognized the modern world's obsession with speed. They saw the same thing in the noble courts of their time. Men who tried to outpace mortality with gold and glory. The monks didn't condemn them. They simply burned their candles and waited. Because they knew what everyone eventually learns. No matter how fast you move, the wax always melts at the same pace. The candle's quiet defiance is that it turns time into beauty. Every second leaves a mark. A little pool of wax, a memory of what once was. The clock erases each moment as soon as it passes. The candle preserves it, transforming loss into shape. That's why, centuries later, the candle still feels like truth. It doesn't promise forever. It just promises now. And maybe that's what we've been trying to return to all along. After all the progress, all the precision, all the glowing lights that never dim, we still find ourselves drawn to this small, flickering thing. It doesn't keep perfect time, but it keeps us human. Somewhere, deep in our collective memory, we're still sitting in that cold stone monastery, listening to the wind outside, watching the wax drip. The bells may be silent now, the clock's digital, the prayers long forgotten, but the flame still burns. It always will, because no matter how many ways we find to measure time, the candle remains the only one that feels alive while doing it. If you sit in a dark room long enough, the candle begins to speak. Not in words, of course, but in rhythm. The tiny pulse of its light feels like breathing, like memory. You start to notice how it reacts to the faintest movement in the air, how one small exhale can bend the flame's spine, how silence makes it stand straighter. You realize that this fragile glow is doing the same thing you are, existing for a little while against the darkness. That's the truth the monks discovered, even if they didn't have the language for it. They weren't just measuring time, they were learning how to live inside it. They understood that the purpose of the candle wasn't accuracy. It was awareness. Each hour that passed wasn't a loss, but a chance to notice. The world, centuries later, still hasn't caught up to that idea. We've built clocks that can measure the vibrations of atoms, satellites that sync seconds across the planet, and networks that can record the exact millisecond a heartbeat falters. But what we haven't learned, what the monks knew without knowing, is that precision doesn't equal presence. You can know the time without living in it. The monks lived in their hours. We live around hours. That's why, when you light a candle today, whether in a cathedral or a quiet apartment, it feels different from flipping a switch. It's not just illumination, it's participation. You become part of the light. You wait for it. You watch it. You share its pace. The candle doesn't just mark time. It restores it. Think about how we describe life. We say we burn out. We keep the flame alive. We lose our spark. Somewhere deep in our language, the candle still defines how we understand ourselves. It's a reminder that being alive isn't about how much light you produce. It's about how you use it before the wax runs out. The monks would have smiled at that thought. They lived with the same paradox every day. Their lives were built around discipline, but their hearts belonged to something softer. Each prayer, each task, each hour was a surrender to the inevitable. The candle would end, and so would the day. And yet, they lit it again every morning. That's faith, not in religion, but in rhythm. Even now, in our perfectly timed world, we still seek that rhythm without realizing it. We count steps, track sleep, schedule rest. We invent digital rituals to mimic the old ones. We crave structure because we've forgotten how to simply be. The monks didn't crave it. They created it, one candle, 1 hour, one breath at a time. And the strange thing is, their rhythm still governs us. When we talk about the hour, when we divide days into 24 parts, when we set alarms or ring bells or mark anniversaries, we're echoing their system. Every smartphone clock, every watch face, every countdown timer. Each is a descendant of that same small flame that once burned in a stone cell, watched by a tired man whispering psalms. You could say the monks invented time as we know it. You could also say they tamed it and then set it free, because they didn't own the hours. They borrowed them. That's the part modern civilization tends to forget. We act as if time belongs to us, as if the clock is our servant. But it's the other way around. Time was here long before us, and it will keep ticking long after we've gone. The monks knew this instinctively. Their candles were never meant to conquer time. They were meant to honor it. That's why their system lasted. Not because it was efficient, but because it was humble. And maybe humility is the one thing missing from all our inventions. We've made light eternal and time mechanical, but we've lost the art of surrender, the grace of watching something end. The monks didn't fear the dark. They respected it. They understood that darkness gives meaning to light the way silence gives shape to music. When the candle went out, the hour was complete. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Just gone. There's beauty in that kind of ending. Clean one. The clock doesn't offer endings. It only offers continuations. It loops endlessly, a perfect circle without closure. The candle, on the other hand, finishes honestly. When it's done, it's done. That honesty is why, after all these centuries, the candle still feels more sacred than any electric light. It doesn't pretend. It knows it's temporary, and it burns anyway. It's hard not to see a reflection of humanity in that. We build monuments, machines, and memories to convince ourselves we're more permanent than we are. But we're not clocks. We're candles. We flicker. We fade. And yet, in that flicker, there's everything: beauty, warmth, fragility, grace. The monks saw that. They didn't need philosophy or psychology to explain it. They just needed wax, flame, and patience. In that sense, their invention wasn't about technology, it was about perspective. They didn't change how the world worked. They changed how people saw it. They taught the world to notice. And in a time when noticing has become rare, maybe that's the truest legacy of all. Because when you light a candle, you don't just illuminate the room, you slow it down. You turn seconds into glow, noise into silence, movement into stillness. You remember that life isn't something to manage, it's something to witness. That's what the monks did. And without meaning to, they passed that lesson to everyone who came after. The clock told us when to live. The candle taught us how. And in the soft space between those two truths, humanity has spent every century since, trying and failing and trying again to balance them. Because in the end, all timekeeping is just another way of saying, I was here. I burned for a while. I gave what light I could. And that, the monks would say, is enough.